about chapter 8, verse 26. We won't do all of that today, but we'll get a good look. We're going to hang out, if you will, in Galilee today with Jesus and his first followers. Now, let me make one sort of techie note for you. I've changed how I'm getting to my notes. Some of you will remember that last week got a little awkward with me reaching over to scroll the screen. So I changed and trying something new. So you may see me glance this way a couple times, and that's where my notes are. And they're set up where I can just click them this time. I won't have to lean over. But that's what I'm doing if you see me glance over there. Okay? All right. So let's jump into the story. If you were able to read this first part of Mark, like I invited you to do, and particularly if you were able to read the first 3 chapters out loud, I wonder if you picked up on the urgency in the story. The words immediately, at once, right away, those kind of phrases abound in Mark, particularly early in the story. It's almost like Mark saying, the time is fulfilled, let's get on with it. And Jesus sort of does. So immediately, Jesus begins calling followers to join him. If you like to read along, I'm going to read first out of Mark 1:16, the very first verse now, and the rest of the gospel after the prologue. Verses that may be familiar to you, okay? So as Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. Skip over to verse 30 with me, still in chapter 1. Jesus has moved around a bit and ends up in the home of Simon. And in verse 30, we find out that Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever. And they told him about her at once. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And the fever left her, and she began to serve with them. By the way, your translation probably says serve them. Horrible. The verb that is there literally does mean serve, but that became the verb the early followers used for doing gospel work, for doing ministry in the world. And so if it's used of men, it's always about doing ministry. But somehow when we use that word with women, we have them getting up making dinner. No. In fact, I don't know about you, but I kind of hope Jesus would not be the kind of person that a woman who's been sick, is now better. And so he says, "So can you fix dinner?" I hope he wouldn't be that kind of guy. So should be translated, she got up and served with them, or even alongside them. If we keep reading right now, we would find Jesus also calling a leper and tax collectors and sinners. And though we won't know it until later in the gospel, a number of women also, not just Simon's mother-in-law, joined this movement. And we'll have a chance to look at those stories as we go. Interestingly, first century people would have looked at this group and would have judged it as sort of, as we might say today, a little bit sketchy. Many of these folks were those who would have been considered unclean and therefore outcast and unworthy of God and of God's people. But we see Jesus calling them and welcoming them and treating them as beloved children of God. You may remember from last week that one characteristic, one key aspect of God's renewal of all creation is that all people, the nations, will stream to Zion to learn the ways of God together, to become children of God together. And we see Jesus living that out as he calls his followers. I mentioned last week, by the way, here's a reminder, that Jesus didn't just say the kingdom of God has drawn near. He then goes out and lives as if that's the truth. And he's doing that in the followers that he chooses to call. We're going to turn now to verse 21, still in chapter 1. A modern historian would try to learn what was the first public thing that Jesus did as part of his mission in Galilee and record that event first. But as I mentioned last week, gospel writers didn't think like modern historians. So they're not recording things in order to set an accurate historical record per se. They therefore could choose. What will I tell my people about first? And part of what that means is that the first event of Jesus' ministry, the first public event of Jesus' mission in Galilee that a gospel writer chooses to tell us is usually a very telling story. This gospel writer found this compelling. This is how I want to launch my story of Jesus. And so it means this story will tell us some significant things about what Mark wanted us to know about Jesus. So in Mark, that first public event is in chapter 1, verse 21. So again, if you'd like to read along with me, please do. So verse 21, they went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having power and not as the scribes. Just then, there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing the man and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed. And they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with power. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. So let's unpack the story a little bit. Okay? After first being amazed at his teaching, did you notice that the people then called Jesus' exorcism a new teaching with power? So you want to note how tightly Mark ties together Jesus' words and what he does. His words are every bit as powerful as what he does. And so you want to remember this as we take a look through Mark's gospel. Now, your translation may say teaching with authority, and I read teaching with power. The Greek word indicates authority in the sense of being very powerful. You know, some people have authority because they hold an office, and a certain authority comes with that office. But other people have authority because they have a great sense of inner power. And so they are authoritative or powerful, whether or not they hold a particular office. And Jesus clearly falls into this second category. And then the people compare him. They compare his teaching with power with the scribes, who would have been the local representatives of the religious, political, and economic power structure of the day. So they held an office, so to speak. Now, before we go further, let's check ourselves. We are often guilty of stereotyping these folks, along with the Pharisees, as being self-righteous, legalistic, and arrogant, and then we're so glad we're not like them. But it would be fairer to them to understand them as the most religious people of their day. And then to ask if we, who are religious people in our day, are ever like them. Okay? So file that away to remember as well. Some of you may remember that I noted last week that this culture was a shame-honor culture. Honor was a pivotal value in that world. It was what came to you as a result of the group that you were a part of, and that had to do with your birth status. So your family, your tribe, your clan, whether you're male or female, how you are born into the world puts you in a particular group. And then once you know your place, then you're supposed to know how to act right, as we say in the South, how people within that group are supposed to act and react in the world. When people misbehave in this world, when they don't conform to expected behaviors, other people shame them into conformity. Okay? That's how that culture worked. Again, a quick comparison is ours is a guilt culture. That's how we tend to get people to conform. You say, that was hurtful, or those kinds of things. So very different kind of cultural dynamic here. So Jesus was a Galilean peasant, and the scribes were among the religious leaders of the area. They were the office holders, so to speak, which means that when Jesus comes into this synagogue and teaches as he teaches, that he has stepped out of his place. But instead of shaming him, the people praise him because his teaching is so powerful. In the dynamics of that culture, this means that the scribes, who were the religious teachers in the area, that their honor as religious teachers has been challenged. A first century audience would know that the scribes are now going to have to check Jesus out and respond to what he's doing, and we will not have to wait long for that to happen. One last thing before we press onward is, do you notice that Mark doesn't tell us about the content of Jesus' teaching in this story? So we're left to wonder, what was so powerful about what he said and how he said it? We don't know yet. Remember that as well as we go on. Okay? All right. Pete, any questions at this point, or should we move on?
No questions at this point.
All right. Good. Okay. From there, we're going to move into one of Mark's favorite ways of telling his story of Jesus. Mark likes to group stories together and to make a point. Scholars will call these cycles of stories. The first of these cycles begins in chapter 2, verse 1. After the reaction of the people in the synagogue in Capernaum, a first century audience knew that the religious leaders are going to have to check Jesus out. They're going to have to come figure him out, knew that there would likely be conflict, and we get it. Starting at chapter 2, verse 1, there is a series of 5 conflict stories between Jesus and the religious leaders. Unfortunately, our time won't let us walk our way through all of them, so we're going to look at the second of these stories in chapter 2, verse 14. Okay? So take a look with me, those of you who like to read along. Chapter 2, verse 14. As Jesus was walking along, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Levi got up and followed. And as Jesus sat at table in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to Jesus' disciples, "Why? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners." This is a great story. Of course, I could say that about any story in Mark, right? So, tax collectors worked for the Roman oppressors, and that made them unclean, outcast, and not well loved by their Jewish neighbors. You may well have already known that. There's some other things that we need to know about tax collectors to help us appreciate this context. First, you don't choose an occupation in this world. Whatever you do, or whatever actually your father does, is what you're going to do. Of course, that's primarily if you're a son. Sometimes that was true for daughters as well. The most important group of which you were a part was your family. And the father was the head of the household. Whatever the father does is what the household does. And the impact of what the father does impacts the entire household. That's a group-oriented culture, and the most important group was family. The second thing for you to know is that at the time of Jesus, Roman occupation of Israel was less than 150 years old. And part of what that means is that no Jew was traditionally a tax collector for the Romans. So how did that happen? Simple answer to that is desperation. And then Rome's exploitation of a man's desperation. So a man loses his land or his business, maybe because of his indebtedness, maybe because Rome has confiscated it. Regardless, he now has no means to provide for his family. What do you do now? If your children are hungry, what would you do? Some first century Jewish men, and actually it would have started before the first century, but some Jewish men in this time agreed to become tax collectors for the Roman oppressors. But from that time on, the family now is a family of tax collectors, and that's what that man's sons will do. A third thing to know about tax collectors is that most of them were not rich. We are very accustomed to the story of Zacchaeus in Luke's gospel. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And Levi, in this story, may have been, because he has a dinner for a whole bunch of people. But most tax collectors weren't rich. So not only are they despised by their neighbors, they're also poor. I mean, what a life, right? So this is the context in which Jesus calls Levi to follow him, welcomes him into this growing group of followers. You notice the comment, there were many who followed him. And then he goes to dinner at Levi's house with many tax collectors and sinners. Now, you need to know that sinners may not be the group that you immediately think of. In our world, sin is a moral failure. And that was true in the first century world also. But sin could also indicate other behaviors that made a person, again, considered to be unworthy of God or God's people. Like, for example, not keeping purity regulations, like ritual washings, for example. And I might add here that people like fishermen and shepherds couldn't. You know, they're out in the world in ways that they can't do ritual washings because of their job. It could be something like your inability to pay your temple tax. It could be that you work in a despised occupation. Tanning hides, for example, was a despised occupation. And it might be that fishing was a despised occupation. So sinners were this bigger group of folks who were considered unclean and therefore outcast and unworthy of God's people. Maybe they're immoral, but maybe not. And they likely joined together at Levi's house because they weren't welcome anywhere else. Now, you may remember also that I said last week that groups in this world were strictly segregated. That's part of how Rome and its allies exercised their power: divide and conquer. Keep people separate, fearful and unsure of one another, create us and them, pit people against each other, and then Rome is able pretty much to control what they're doing. And nowhere is this segregation illustrated more clearly than in their table practices. In this world, you only ate with people like yourself, unless your name was Jesus of Nazareth. So we put all this together again and see Jesus sitting at table with these folks at Levi's house. What we have is that once again, Jesus is stepping out of his place. You know, we're going to find out, and this is no surprise to you, but we're going to find out that Jesus is an incredibly compassionate person as he moves through Galilee and finally into Jerusalem. And so I find myself having to believe that he looked past all of the cultural condemnations that fell on these people and saw the desperation and suffering of these folks, and then wanted to bring them into the circle of God's grace and mercy, right? So that's the setup for the story and the conflict. The religious leaders now step into the story and ask Jesus' disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now they do two things here. First, they have just raised the most common charge that's going to be leveled against Jesus in the Gospels. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. And I hope by now you can begin to see why that practice was so significant and spoke volumes in that world. So they've raised the most common charge leveled against Jesus. And then the second thing they do is, as they raise this charge, they show themselves to be tied to the way things are. Though they would claim to be doing what they're doing for religious purposes, they show that they agree with Rome's basic approach to order, with segregating groups and declaring some people to be outcast and unworthy. But Jesus imagines and is making possible a world where everyone is welcome to the table. Consequently, I read his response to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, as just a little bit snarky. And here's what I mean by that. People who don't know or won't admit that something is wrong won't go see a doctor. A doctor can't heal people who don't think they're in need of any healing. So as long as the religious leaders don't see anything wrong with the way the world is currently ordered, they won't be interested in imagining the world differently with Jesus. But the tax collectors and sinners knew how Roman order had inflicted suffering on them and on their families, and they knew that the system was unjust. They knew it was sick. And so they are much more willing at this point to sit at table with Jesus and to encounter a different way of being in the world. So the conflict cycle of stories then continues, and each time the conflict is going to be over religious practices. Why don't your disciples fast? The religious leaders ask in the next story. And the implication, of course, is that truly religious people would fast. But have you ever thought about how cruel it would be to ask poor people who know hunger, to ask them to fast? So Jesus doesn't. Why do your disciples do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? They ask in the next story. And what were the disciples doing? They were plucking heads of grain and eating on the Sabbath. You know, who needs a Sabbath more? A day of rest and a day of delight in the Lord. Who needs that more than people who have to work long, long hours just to eat? But the religious leaders have made Sabbath into another burden for them to bear. Wrong, Jesus said. The Sabbath was made for humankind, not the other way around. And then there is the last story in this conflict cycle, which starts in chapter 3, verse 1. And it's another going to the synagogue on the Sabbath story. This whole thing got kicked off by a moment in a synagogue on Sabbath, and here we are again. So Jesus is there, likely to teach again, and a man with a withered hand is there. And in that world, a withered hand likely means he can't work, and so he can't provide for his family. And the religious leaders are also there. And they're watching to see if Jesus is going to heal this guy, but not so they can celebrate with him, but so they will have in their minds a legitimate reason to go after Jesus. So that the problem exposed in all of these conflict stories is that these religious leaders actually have Roman imaginations. That's a phrase I used last week when discussing how hard Rome worked, all of their propaganda, all of their use of media, how hard Rome worked to get people to see the world the way they wanted them to see the world. We've already talked about Rome segregating groups and practicing divide and conquer. Roman order also included hierarchy, a very few men ruling the world for everybody else. We're going to find, as we keep reading Mark, that all of the religious leaders in Israel, The scribes and Pharisees that we have met in these stories, and then all the ones we'll meet later, elders, priests, chief priests in Jerusalem, all of them. First of all, they're connected, even if the connection is sometimes pretty uneasy. They're all connected, but they all also accept that Rome's way of ordering the world is just the way things are. This is the way the world operates. And that's why I say they have Roman imaginations, though they don't have any love for their Roman overlords at all. The scribes and Pharisees that we meet in these stories would likely prefer that their particular group could switch places with the chief priests in Jerusalem. If the world is ordered this way after all, you may as well try to get it to the top, get yourself to the top of it. And here's the rub. They are using their religion to raise their honor and to help themselves get to the top. Remember, I said last week, religion and politics are just inextricably intertwined here. No separation of church and state as in our time. So these religious leaders are saying to the folks in Galilee, look, we fast. That's how religious we are. We understand how to observe Sabbath, and we will tell you what you can and cannot do. We know who the sinners are that you should avoid so you won't be made unclean. We know what forgiveness entails. That was the first story that we didn't have a chance to look at. So listen to us and honor us as those who are leading you in this time. Let's be clear, this is not a Jewish problem. Everybody in this story is a Jew. So the Jewishness of these religious leaders is not the issue. The problem here isn't their Jewishness, and the problem isn't confined to Judaism. This is a problem for all religions and their religious practices. Do we engage in our religious practices so as to deepen our relationship with God and our participation in God's work in the world? Or do our religious practices serve our own purposes and pursuits? Or we might ask it this way: do our religious practices serve our own egos? Jesus, as we have seen, as we are seeing and will see, imagines the world very differently than they do. And he's going to illustrate that in his living and teaching. But the conclusion of the story in chapter 3 verses 1 to 6, which is also the conclusion to the cycle of stories, really illustrates the differences for us. Jesus asked them, he calls the man with the withered hand forward, and then he asked the religious leaders, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? And then he heals the man's hand and essentially gives his life back to him. But the religious leaders leave the synagogue and plot Jesus' death. So there's your contrast, right? Religious practice that is focused on God leads to life. Religious practice that serves ego leads to death. It seems to me that this cycle of stories begs us to ask ourselves, do my religious practices serve God or me? Do they lead to life or to death? Pretty challenging set of stories. Okay. Pete, do we need to go on, or are there questions?
We have some questions.
All right.
The first question goes back to the exorcism story.
Okay.
Since that first story sets the tone for the gospel, what relevance does it have that the unclean spirit obeyed Jesus?
Excellent question. My hesitation is I'm trying to figure out how to answer this and not take the rest of our time. The simple answer is that in the first century world, their understanding of the spiritual world was in many ways more robust than ours. Our very scientific culture and sometimes encourages us not to have a robust sense of a spiritual world, but first century people did. And so this idea of spirits that are either positive or negative, either demonic or godly, being a part of the world was commonplace for them. And their understanding was that they're Jewish. For Jews, the understanding was that God was the one God who created all that exists. And so God is the one who ultimately is, I don't want to use the word ruler because that makes you think like a king or something, or an emperor. But God is the one who's over. How about that? We'll just say that God is the one who's over, all of creation. And so God's word carries the day. So that when Jesus speaks a word and the demons obey, he's illustrating again the power that is at work in him. And we mentioned a new teaching of power. It's clearly the power of God. So excellent question. And I hope that too short answer will suffice. Okay. All right, Pete, we have another one?
Yeah, we have two more. If males followed the occupation of the father, what's an example of the occupation or path that women followed?
Culturally speaking, women didn't follow an occupational path. Culturally speaking, women's role was to produce legitimate sons, heirs to the business or estate if it's a high-ranking folk. So in terms of the cultural dynamics, there was no occupation path for women to take. Now, that doesn't mean some women didn't. You know, and I know that there are the rules. There's the rules up here, and then there's real life. And so some women did. Sometimes poverty is a great equalizer. If the crops are in the field have to be gotten in, all of the family members go out and bring that in. If the shop has to continue functioning when a son or a father is ill or has a withered hand and is unable to work, a daughter will step in because you have to. Because you can talk all you want to about what the rules are, but when it comes to the family eating, surviving, everybody pitches in and does what needs to be done. So technically speaking, culturally speaking, there was no occupation path for women. In reality, women would often participate in the family occupation, and sometimes out of necessity, and sometimes because they were just really good at it. And that's just true. And so they would work anyway, despite the cultural dynamics. Good question also. Okay. Anything else here, Pete?
There are two others. They're kind of the same question in a way. What do you think is the primary message our culture needs to hear today from these early Mark chapters? Or what's the primary point the church needs to have ears to hear from these early chapters of Mark?
Boy, I'd have a hard time choosing a primary. There are a number of things, a number of questions that I think these early chapters beg us to consider. One of which would be our understanding of the promises of God that are being fulfilled. I don't know that we've talked a lot in church about God at work to renew all of creation. Saving us as individuals from our sins, yes, but God just doesn't stop there. The renewal of all creation so that it reflects God's grace and mercy, God's justice and peace as God always intended for creation. And that's the promise. And Jesus' teaching was that is unfolding. And so that would be one thing that comes to mind. And then the second thing that immediately comes to mind is one I raised a moment ago. How often do we in the church actually look more like the religious leaders in this story than we look like Jesus and his followers in that world? That's a daunting question, but I think it's one that we would do well to have the courage to ask ourselves as we go forward.
That's it for now. Let's keep going.
All right. So pushing ahead then with the story of Mark, there is another great cycle of stories that starts in chapter 4, verse 35 and goes to the end of chapter 5. And it is a cycle of miracle stories. But whoa, not just any miracles here. So not just an exorcism, but an exorcism of a legion of demons. Not just a healing story, but a healing of a 12-year illness. Not just a healing story, but raising a 12-year-old girl from the dead. And the cycle begins with Jesus stilling a storm on the sea, which reminds readers that God created all that exists. And this is related to the question was asked a moment ago about the demons obeying Jesus in the synagogue. The creator in Jewish tradition is the only one who is able to control the sea. But here Jesus controls the sea. So it's the power of the creator of all that exists that is at work in him as he controls the sea. So very powerful miracles, but there's more. Maybe for a first century audience, even more significant would have been what the miracles evoked, what they would have prompted Mark's audience to ponder. A legion was actually a Roman military term, by the way, denoted 6,000 to 10,000 soldiers. Division is how Rome governed, as we've noted, including by gender. And we have Jesus healing 2 women in these particular stories. And death is Rome's primary power. You either cooperate with Roman rule and live divided within and among yourselves, or face death. That's how Rome ruled in the world. And those who had Roman imaginations would say, Rome is just too powerful. They're invincible. And this is just the way things are. So we have to go along to get along. We have to move in the world the way it is. We have to be practical. I always love that phrase. We have to be practical. But these stories invite us to see that the Creator's power of life, well-being, and inclusion are on the loose in our world. And look what happens. Look what is possible as a result. A little girl comes back to life. An old woman is healed of a 12-year illness and ends up bearing witness to Jesus before a whole crowd. Even a legion of demonic hordes is no match for the power of the Creator of life who is at work in Jesus. What a cycle of stories, that is. And again, time will allow us to work our way through each of them, which is, kind of too bad, but it is what it is, right? So there are these 2 marvelous cycles of stories that Mark tells us, and sandwiched between them is a fascinating moment in the story. Chapter 4, again, for those of you who want to read along, we're going to do some reading again. Sandwiched between these 2 cycles of stories is Mark's first detailed presentation of Jesus' teaching as he's traveling through Galilee and sharing table with the people there and healing them. Remember how we noted that the story of Jesus was moving at breakneck speed, immediately, at once, right away. Remember that we noted that Mark told us that Jesus was teaching, but Mark didn't give us the content of that teaching because the story was moving at such, rapid pace. Okay, at Mark 4:1, Mark suddenly slows the story down and invites us to do the same and to go sort of sit down beside the Sea of Galilee and hear what Jesus is teaching. And as Mark does so, he is signaling to us that what follows is significant. Let's pay attention. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to pick up in chapter 4, verse 2. So Jesus began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun came, it was scorched. And since it had no root, it withered away. A friend of mine always says, no root, no fruit. Other seed fell among thorns, And the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30, 60, and 100-fold. And he said to them, let the one who has ears to hear, hear. Many of us are likely familiar with this parable, so let's review it. As the sower in Jesus' story goes out to sow, the first 3/4 of his seed falls on ground where it yields no fruit. Again, we know that part of the story. Birds, rocky soil, thorns, no fruit. But in a world where peasants worked long, long hours just to survive, failure of 3/4 of your seed is a disaster, right? And then the punchline. The last seed fell into good soil and yielded 30, 60, and 100-fold. Scholars tell us that a 7-to-1 return on your seed in that world was a good crop. A 10-to-1 return was a bumper crop. But what's 30, 60, and 100-fold? I mean, that's a yield that probably those first century folks would have trouble imagining. So that Jesus' hearers may have gone from sort of wincing, oh, poor guy, to wide-eyed amazement in a matter of seconds. And then, let the one who has ears to hear, hear. And Jesus is done. He's done. I always figure, as a good Southerner would do, he says, okay, y'all come back. Hope you have a good evening. You know, he's done. He doesn't explain. Jesus tells the parable and he leaves it out there for his hearers to ponder. And don't you know, those folks, when they were walking back home, were going, what do you think he meant by that? It may have niggled at them all evening. What's he trying to say? And that's probably exactly what Jesus wanted to happen. Let's look then at verse 10. When Jesus was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. Before we go ahead, there are 2 things here I don't want you to miss. First, notice those who were around him along with the 12. In Mark, there is always a larger group hanging out with Jesus than just 12 men. And there, again, we've been told many followers. When Mark means the 12, he'll let you know. So always imagine that group when you think of these folks. And the second thing is, they asked him about the parables, plural. So they're not asking about the sower parable by itself. They want to know why Jesus teaches in parables, period. Okay? And then Jesus responds, verse 11. To you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God. And if your translation says secret, boy, that's poor. The Greek word is literally mysterion. You could translate that and you don't agree about that, right? So to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables. So that, here's my literal translation of what comes next. So that, seeing they may see and not see, and hearing they may hear and not understand, so that they may not turn and be forgiven. Okay, that's clear, right? Let me start with that word mystery, which I began. It's important that we translate it as mystery because in Jewish tradition, a mystery is something a human being can know and understand, but only because God reveals it. We don't figure it out. God reveals it, and then we either receive the revelation or not. Now, maybe you think, well, of course you would receive God's revelation. Really? What if the revelation is not what you expect or want? What if it messes up your sense of order in the world? What if it challenges your sense of your place in the world? One of David White's poems begins with this line, revelation must be terrible. And then the poem goes on and describes the way you can never go back to the way things were before. So God reveals. And Jesus is setting forth the revelation of the mystery of God's kingdom via his parables. But outsiders, Jesus says, see but do not see, hear but do not understand, so that they will not turn and be forgiven. Boy, these seem a puzzler, huh? But Jesus is actually drawing on the great Jewish prophetic tradition that has come before him. You can take a look, for example, in Isaiah 6:9. And in that tradition, God doesn't appoint some to be outsiders and some to be insiders. That's not the message. Instead, God speaks a prophetic word. God gives a revelation. And then the way people respond to that revelation show whether they are insiders or outsiders. Those who receive God's revelation, however much it may shake up their lives and their world, those folks are clearly insiders. But outsiders won't receive it. And so they won't turn, and they don't put themselves in the path of forgiveness. Now, in verse 13, the disciples, Jesus says to them, you're not getting this parable, so how are you going to get them? Which means we're not real sure they're insiders or outsiders yet. But because Jesus is incredibly gracious and patient, he explains the parable to them in verses 14 to 20. But when he's through with his explanation, he returns to his explanation of why he teaches in parables. We're going to pick up in verse 21. So Jesus said to them, is a lamp brought in to be put under the bushel basket or under the bed and not on the lampstand? For there's nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor is anything secret except to come to light. Let anyone with ears to hear, hear. And he said to them, see what you hear. Nothing is hidden except to be revealed. Those parables, as odd as they are intentional. They're supposed to make us go, wait, what? What are you saying? What are you suggesting here? They're supposed to do that for us. But in order for that to happen, and in order for that to lead somewhere, Jesus calls his followers to see what you hear. Now, your translation likely says pay attention or maybe take heed. But the Greek word is really simple. The Greek word is just see what you hear, which of course we can't literally do. We can't see the words coming out of our mouths. So Jesus must mean a kind of seeing that's more than what we do with our physical eyes. Sometimes when we understand something that we've not understood before, we might say, oh, I see. We might call this kind of sight being insightful, where we know we have to look beneath the surface and beyond appearances, because those can be deceiving. After all, no fruit from 3/4 of your seed looks like a disaster, but it isn't. Not in Jesus' parable. So see what you hear, Jesus calls to his disciples. And then he adds, I'm going to pick up the reading in the middle of verse 24. The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given you. For to those who have, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. That is, those who are willing to see, who are open to God's revelation, will find themselves, Jesus says, seeing more and more and more of what God is doing in the world. But those who are unwilling to see will become unable to see. I thought of Jesus' teaching here not long ago when I heard a writer say, if we only accept what we can see with our physical eyes, we will never live beyond what we can see. And Jesus is here calling us to see beyond. Throughout Mark's gospel, we're going to find this to be a key theme. Mark is constantly calling his disciples to see. So as you read Mark, anytime you see, pay attention or take heed or even watch out or beware, the Greek word is likely simply see. in the language that I've been using thus far, Jesus wants his people to realize that they have been shaped into having Roman imaginations, that Rome has worked to get them to see the world the way Rome wants them to see the world. And Jesus wants them to let that go. Jesus wants them to open themselves to see instead what God is doing and what God is offering, to see the life that God is inviting them to share in God's kingdom. This is Jesus teaching with power. Words as powerful as healing a 12-year-old girl or a 12-year illness. His teaching begs us to ask ourselves questions like these. Are we willing to receive God's revelation, even if the revelation might shake up our lives? Who or what has shaped or maybe is shaping our imaginations about what's possible in God's world? Are we willing to see, to become insightful? Are we willing to imagine our way of living and God's work in the world the way Jesus does? Does our response to God's revelation show us to be insiders or outsiders? And you may be hearing the text ask other questions. Okay, Pete, I almost ran us to our time, but are there questions that we need to address before we close up today?
Well, one question, which is how in today's world do we get God's imagination or God's mystery? Where are the sources for that?
Mark? That's a good question, and I think the answer is there are multiple opportunities, but we have to commit ourselves to those. Of course, as a teacher of New Testament and as someone who lives my life with my nose stuck in the pages of the New Testament, I would say that's where we start. The New Testament is constantly calling us to see what God is doing in the world. And, we often talk about the Bible as the best-selling book in all of the world. Every year tops the bestseller list, but we also know it's buying them and reading them are different things. Mm-hmm. And it's not easy to read. I'm not going to pretend that. But to live in the words of the New Testament would absolutely shape us. But there are also great teachers who make the teaching of the New Testament more available for us. Joan Chittister comes to mind immediately. Parker Palmer comes to mind immediately. And there are others who are grabbing hold of New Testament message and can invite us to see differently. But a big part of this has to be important to us, and we commit ourselves to doing it in that regard. Okay? Right. Anything else, Pete?
There is one more question, but I'm going to let you give your homework assignment, and then this question will, I think, guide us into next week, and you can begin next week by answering this question. So homework first.
Okay. So if you have a chance to get the handout that Pete and I tried to get to everybody, you've got homework there about reading through the rest of the mission in Galilee, all the way through the end of the journey to Jerusalem. So all the way to the end of chapter 10, and to read out loud if you can. That's chapter 6, starting at verse 30 through chapter 8, verse 10. So if you can do that, that's great. But in addition to that, I invite you to take a gander at a map of first century Israel as you kind of read through this week. Many of your Bibles will have them. You can Google it easily. Just put first century Israel map and it'll come up. And just kind of see if you can notice where Jesus is as he travels around in the rest of his mission in and around Galilee. And then finally, note how often you encounter the idea of seeing. Remember, your English translation may say, watch out, or take heed, or pay attention, or even beware. And so you can take a look and just kind of note that to yourself as we go through. Okay? Very good. All right, Pete, you want to tell us what the question is we're going to begin next week with?
Yes. I am curious if Mitzi has further reflections on Jesus's calling of the disciples. Their introductory interactions are so brief, but the art of calling and following is so consequential. Why those individuals? Did they take persuading? Were they curious about the role? Had they heard of or encountered Jesus before? Did they hesitate? The text doesn't say.
Right. It doesn't say. So, okay, good. We can start there next week because we're going to talk about the disciples a good bit next week as we turn we finish the mission in Galilee and journey to Jerusalem. So,
great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Miner, and we will see everybody next week.
Okay, good. Thanks, everyone. Have blessings on your week.